They said it was only a flare, a brief shimmer on the augers, some distortion where the void ought to have stayed flat. Static, maybe. Solar interference. Maybe even a Lock-Sattel stealth rig, or just old machine spirit drift. But the moment stretched. It deepened. It opened. The Vox screamed first, not words, just pressure, like sound without source. A presence tearing through channels never meant to carry intention. Then came the lights. Inside the pick screens, behind the lumen casings, shapes, faces, mirrors that didn't reflect but watched. One astropath died on contact, not from rupture, not from bleed, from belief collapse. He saw something and couldn't convince his brain to keep existing. By the time the Geller field failed, the crew wasn't screaming anymore. They were whispering, dozens of them. Different words, same tone, low, rhythmic, like recitation, like liturgy. Some had torn their tongues out by then, but they kept whispering. No one ever says it aloud, but everyone who served Voidside long enough knows. The warp doesn't invade. It arrives, like mold, like blood from somewhere you didn't get cut, like an old hymn you realize you've been humming, alone, in your hab for 3 hours. This breach didn't roar, it bled, through seams in the hull, through the prayers carved into the decks, through the minds of the navigators, eyes closed, mouths open, reciting star patterns that hadn't existed yet. There were still Geller harmonics at 12.4 Hz. There was still sacral shielding engaged at full power. There were still golden aquilae sanctified in blessed unguents. None of it mattered. This wasn't a failure of faith, it was a reminder. This was not a place with borders. This was a place that allowed borders, when it wanted to. It came silently, like breath fogging inside a sealed helmet, like oil rising in a corpse's eye. The Materium had never left. It had just been still, waiting. The first mistake wasn't trusting the warp, it was assuming it had shape. Before the Imperium, before Old Earth even unified under warlords and proto-administratum cliques, humanity had already stepped into the void with chart in hand and arrogance in heart. The age of technology didn't begin with discovery, it began with assumption. Early warp transit was crude, blind in truth. Navigators hadn't yet emerged from their gene-altered cocoons. The Astronomicon was an impossibility. And the warp? It was not a map, it was a mirror. The more they tried to chart it, the more it reflected back lies made from their own certainties. Temporal drift would place arrival dates before departure logs. Ships would pass through entire star systems that didn't exist when they entered the rift, only to vanish from records entirely after exiting. The best cartographers went mad. The worst became prophets. They called it the flux. Some thought it a storm, others thought it divine. Some, like the shipmaster Varelli of the Iron Mirth, believed they could master it by making the maps themselves into living things. Her navigators had skin etched with stellar paths. They were dissected upon death, their bones catalogued as coordinates. Her ship never returned. But one of her navigators did, found drifting in a life pod, laughing, with lungs full of starlight and teeth carved into runes. The first warp charts were not based on physics. They were based on interpretation, sensor shadows, psycho dreams, emperor-blessed auguries, and overlapping fragments of shared hallucination. It wasn't a navigation system, it was a doctrine. Systems were marked not by distance, but by consequence. This place consumes souls. That place speeds time. This corridor forgets what you are, unless you keep praying. These were not trajectories. These were warnings. But bureaucracy made it law. As the Imperium formed and expanded, the ineffable became procedural. The maps were canonized. Shrines were built over scars. Warp routes were sanctified, not because they were safe, but because they had worked once. Transit lanes like the Erebus Spine or the Ninefold Trace became trade arteries. Entire sectors were governed based on the assumption that the warp could be known, controlled, described. But the warp is not distance. It is not direction. It is not a volume of space. It is a lie that tolerates being believed. And when that belief becomes structure, it bleeds back into the structure. Every Imperial chart is both a triumph and a curse. The more you think you know the path, the more the warp knows you. It doesn't just exist, it responds. The warp isn't a storm, it isn't a medium, it's not a backdrop to be crossed. It's a place, but not in the way places behave. It listens, it feels, it interprets, and what's worse, it remembers. The Materium is not passive. It never was. Every translation through its depths, every flare of emotion from the minds of real space, bleeds meaning into it. And meaning in the warp condenses. It forms eddies, currents, impressions. A death screamed in desperation leaves a mark. A war fought with fury leaves a trench. A world that dies in betrayal doesn't just vanish, it's echoed permanently in a place where memory isn't a function of time, but of weight. Imperial theologians describe it as the Sea of Souls, but that's mercy. Souls don't drift, they crash, they imprint, they're not swallowed, they're absorbed. And in return, the warp projects back. Not images, not symbols, intent. Ships report being followed through the warp by screaming reflections of themselves. Entire battle groups have been known to arrive at their destination with crew members who were never aboard, speaking in the voices of lost ancestors or executed traitors. And in some corridors, entire vessels vanish, leaving only vox signals transmitting emotions, raw, wordless, and devastating. What the Imperium calls demons are not invaders. They are symptoms, manifestations of accumulated will, trauma, belief, obsession. They are not alive in the traditional sense. They are consciousness given shape, without context. You cannot deceive the warp. It does not process lies. It metabolizes them. A heretic prays falsely, and the lie is consumed, reshaped, turned against him. A loyalist full of doubt enters translation and sees himself executed in the corridor ahead by a version of himself that believes more perfectly. These aren't illusions. They're refractions, psychic artifacts born of the Immaterium's need to express what real space tries to bury. The warp does not forget the Great Crusade. It doesn't forget betrayal. It doesn't forget a single scream on Istvan or the ritual slaughter of a nameless sect on a dead moon no one even mapped. It doesn't need to. Because it is still happening. The warp is not a place you enter. It's a place that enters you each time you think you've left it behind. Every astropath carries a little more of it home. Every navigator sings a deeper note in their sleep. And every Geller field that holds the tide for one more second only does so because the warp is allowing it. For now, you don't worship the warp, you feed it. The Chaos Gods weren't born, they accumulated. They weren't sculpted into being. They coalesced from patterns, from rhythms, from blood spilled in ritual repetition until reality bent to acknowledge it. Khorne didn't manifest because someone screamed his name. He manifested because everyone screamed it without knowing. Every battlefield in human history. Every duel fought to the death under alien suns. Every sacrifice made with rage in the heart and purpose in the blow. The warp took that momentum and reflected it, sharpened it, gave it a voice, a throne, a crown of skulls that no longer needed a metaphor. Slaanesh was not summoned, she was inevitable. When the Eldar stopped fearing consequence and started sculpting entire pocket realms around ecstasy, dominance, and sensation, when their species turned emotion into empire, the warp listened. And when enough screams aligned, Slaanesh opened her eyes, fully formed, surrounded by the echo of the pleasure that birthed her. Nurgle is not rot. He is the moment before despair becomes surrender. That grim relief when you give in and stop fighting. That sick joke whispered to yourself as you watch your organs liquefy. In the warp, that comfort matters. And it grows. Tzeentch isn't hope. He's the impulse behind it. The change that won't stop. The mutating need to twist what is into what might be endlessly. Magic, betrayal, destiny, recursion. These aren't tools to him. They are him. These aren't gods of a people. They're gods of behaviors. And they don't grant miracles. They reward patterns. In real space, you might say a prayer to survive. In the warp, every emotion is a liturgy. Every fear is a hymn. The warp doesn't care what you mean. It cares what you feel. Your sorrow for a lost brother nourishes Nurgle. Your righteous fury in battle builds Khorne's throne. Every whisper of rebellion twists Tzeentch's schemes tighter. Every decadent indulgence, every hunger you won't admit, it's a tithe to Slaanesh. And when 1 billion minds across 1,000 worlds all feel the same thing at once, the warp listens louder. There are no atheists in the warp. There are only meals. Even the Emperor, in all his divine isolation, couldn't stop the belief that gathered around him, couldn't halt the prayers offered in his name. He may have rejected godhood, but the warp didn't. It couldn't. It doesn't care what the truth is. It cares what hurts the most. There are places even the warp does not frequent. This is not superstition. It is not metaphor. It is not fear masquerading as mystery. It is observed, in the way navigators flinch when plotting certain vectors, in how demons recoil from segments of the flow they should dominate, in how entire regions of the Materium pass too smoothly, like slipping through breath held by something older than breath. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica doesn't name them, not officially. But within the deep logs of the Navis Nobilitae and the black-bound marginalia of Forbidden Libraria, they are called what they are: hollows, null zones of meaning. Not emptiness, but absence made aggressive. Absence that resists being known. These regions do not echo with psychic resonance. They suffocate it. Astropaths experience sensory blackout. Demons flicker. Rituals fail. Even the Empyrean glow that bleeds across warp space dims. Geller fields strain, but not from intrusion. From confusion. Their machine spirits howl, not because something is pressing in, but because something has vanished so completely that the field no longer knows what it's holding back. Some theorize these pockets are scars, residual collapse events from before the Chaos Gods cohered. Others believe they're not scars, but roots, that these are anchor points, deep strata where the warp connects to realities older than the warp itself, structures buried under eons of psychic sediment, anti-myths, frameworks that do not care what you believe, only that you do not approach. A few have tried. Rogue psychers, excommunicated navigators, word-bearers seeking the silent thrones of forgotten deities. Their accounts, when they return at all, are riddled with contradiction. No demons, no visions, no temptation. Just distance, not spatial, not temporal. A kind of ideological vertigo. One astropath described it as being watched by nothing. Another simply wept for 3 days, repeating the phrase, "The silence is shaped." Not even the gods speak of these places. And that silence is louder than any scream they've ever loosed. What lies beneath the warp is not chaos. It is not rage, lust, decay, or change. It is non-response. The universe turning its back. Not erasing, but refusing to write. And when a dimension like the warp recoils from something, not out of pain, but out of recognition, you start to wonder whether the Materium is truly the deepest place, or just the softest. To travel through the warp is to break, not metaphorically, not poetically, physically, spiritually, systemically. The moment a voidcraft enters translation, every law that defines the universe is placed on pause, and something else is allowed to write its own. From the outside, it's an instant. 1 second, a ship glides along the real space tide. The next, it's gone, swallowed by the warp's bloom. But inside the hull, time doesn't behave. For the crew, the translation doesn't feel like a moment. It feels like rupture. First, the sound, not noise, but an unraveling. The hull doesn't groan, it mourns. Litanies carved into its bones activate in sequence, not to protect, but to distract. Geller fields spark into tortured song. Machine spirits scream. Some tech priests claim they can hear binary prayers change tone, like the engines know they've been cut loose from certainty. Then comes the pressure, not on the skin, not on the lungs, on the memory. What you were starts to feel optional. Crewmen forget their own names mid-sentence. Servitors execute contradictory orders. Officers repeat orders that were never given. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes people die from things that haven't happened yet. The navigators see worst of all. Locked in their sanctum, third eye open, they stare directly into the flow, into the raw subjective. They don't guide the ship. They steer reality's permission. Some return with frost clinging to their hair from stars that don't exist. Others age backwards. A few speak in voices that don't belong to any known species. And one, a legend known only as the Veiled, has navigated without moving, claiming to pull space toward the ship instead of the other way around. There is blood sometimes, not always, not when things go well. But even in successful jumps, the warp marks you. A nosebleed, a bad dream, a prayer you didn't mean to say, a rust pattern on the floor that looks like your child's face even though they died before you shipped out. This is the wound. Translation isn't entry, it's penetration. The warp doesn't just open, it tears. And the Geller field isn't a wall, it's a tourniquet. It doesn't stop the bleed. It slows it long enough for you to pretend you're whole. And when you come out the other side, real space takes you back. But it doesn't take all of you. Something always stays behind. Or worse, something comes with you. Sometimes the translation doesn't fail. Sometimes it succeeds wrong. There are records, sealed, redacted, buried under centuries of denial, of ships arriving before they departed, of vessels returning from a 2-week jump with logs indicating years of internal time, of captains who swear they died during transit, and yet are speaking, breathing, bleeding on the docking bay floor. The warp doesn't obey time, it doesn't understand continuity, and it does not respect cause. What emerges from it isn't always what went in, not because something attacked, but because the warp doesn't agree with your story. Ask the crew of the St. Halcyon, a lunar-class cruiser translated from the Scarswell system en route to Segmentum Solar. 18 days expected in the Materium. They exited on time. Perfect log harmony, Vox intact, no Geller anomalies. But the crew didn't match the manifest. Every ID tag was accurate, every face correct. But each of them had different memories, different histories. One lieutenant insisted his homeworld had never existed. Another had records of service to a Lord General that no one else had ever heard of, and a regimental tattoo from a unit never formed. Medical scans confirmed their DNA. Cogitator logs showed no tampering. And yet when asked about their time in transit, all they said was, "We heard laughter from the engine room. We stopped laughing back." That's when things started making sense again. The Ordo Chronos calls them concordant fractures, points where real space and warp timelines phase shift out of alignment. But even they admit it's not science, it's damage control. Some ships arrive crewless, with no signs of violence, just uniforms arranged neatly in the mess. Others return full of passengers no one remembers boarding, who speak in dialects never recorded. One freighter, the Iron Sorrow, re-entered real space with a full complement of 74. 43 of them had been dead for a decade. The other 31 were children who matched no birth registry, but looked exactly like the original crew as infants. And then there are the ghosts, not the demons. Those can be fought, named, banished. These are logic scars, residual events replayed, officers barking orders from non-existent bridges, bulkheads sealed in iron but screaming like lungs, entire ships lost inside themselves, doors opening onto versions of the ship that are older, newer, or burning still. When breach logic takes hold, you don't see monsters. You see consequences with no cause. And the warp doesn't apologize. It doesn't correct itself. It doesn't snap back into place. It just moves on. You weren't supposed to notice, but you did. Not all spaces surrender to the warp. Some fight, others seal. A few simply turn their backs, and the warp, impossibly, does not follow. These are not sanctuaries, they are exclusions. The Webway is the oldest and best known. Built by the Eldari long before their fall, it's a labyrinth corridor network punched through unreality. Neither in the warp nor in real space, but riding the membrane between them. It doesn't nullify the warp, it sidesteps it. Inside, there are no demons, no translation wounds, no rift hymns screaming at your hull. But the price is control. Navigation requires psychic attunement at a level the Imperium cannot replicate. One wrong turn and you enter a dead zone that's been sealed for millennia. Or worse, you brush against the webway's fractured edges, where the dark city pulses and the echoes of She Who Thirsts still feed. Then there is the labyrinth dimension, a tesseract domain of impossible angles, rooted in Necron design. This is not bypass, this is denial. The labyrinth doesn't allow warp logic. Inside, causality obeys mechanical priority. Distance is calculated, not felt. Emotion is meaningless. It's not that demons can't enter, it's that they can't exist there. The Noctis null zones, anomalous voids found around certain Necron tomb worlds, seem to generate anti-psychic suppression fields so absolute that not even astropathic echoes register. In these places, even prayer falls dead. Even hate feels thin. And without that emotional fuel, the warp has nothing to cling to. It slips off, like breath on glass that never fogs. The enslavers once weaponized this principle. Their ancient pre-warp control systems are believed to have included pocket reality bulwarks, stasis-insulated anchor zones that denied the flow of consciousness, creating sterile zones where their mental domination could not be countered by psychers. These systems remain buried, largely forgotten, but a few rogue tech priests have uncovered references in deep Mechanicus vaults, marked with red ink pictograms. Thoughtless space. And then there are the black cubes. Monolithic, planet-sized constructs scattered in deep, uncharted regions. They don't pulse, they don't emit, they consume registration. Augurs don't return from scans. Vox echoes vanish at their event horizon. When Geller fields near them, the fields weaken, not from corruption, but from inversion. Like the warp is being pulled inward, starved, starched dry. Some believe these are weapons from a war fought before the warp woke. Others say they're prisons, but the pattern holds. Every realm of rejection isn't safe. It's silent, not peace, not light, just the absence of hunger. And to those who spend their lives riding the tides of madness, that absence feels louder than a scream. There's a theory buried deep in Ordo Malleus vaults, classified beyond exterminatus clearance, sealed beneath 12 layers of contradiction. Not heresy, not even forbidden, just denied by silence. It speaks of a place the warp cannot touch. Not repelled by faith, not sealed behind hexagrammic wards, not denied by technology or psychic nullification, but something worse. A place that subtracts, where emotion doesn't fail, it unravels, where thought erodes the moment it forms, where language collapses not from lack of meaning, but from the absence of assumption. No metaphor, no soul, no echo. A true anti-warp. The ancient texts don't call it a dimension. They call it the absence beyond shape, a place with no psychic imprint, no energetic signature, no anchors for demons, no reflection. Because it offers no permission. Not even the warp hates it. It ignores it. Because it cannot feed from it. It cannot mirror it. It cannot interpret what offers no pattern. The theories diverge on its origin. Some claim it's the last vestige of a pre-conscious universe, what reality was before life infected it with narrative. Others say it's artificial. A construct made by a civilization so advanced they didn't master the warp. They rejected the premise of belief itself. They removed their dimension from emotional resonance, not out of fear, but because they found something more perfect than thought. The Inquisition recovered a fragment once, a sliver of non-material found on a derelict station adrift near the Ghoul stars. It had no mass, no temperature. It could be seen, but not described. Any Lex mechanic who attempted to document it suffered permanent aphasia. One Magos managed to encode its outline in a data loom using counter-recursive script, language with no reference. The file crashed every cogitator that accessed it, not from overload, from conceptual contradiction. The Grey Knights took it, and the room it was in, and the data, and the Magos. They burned the section of the ship into vacuum and wrote nothing about it in the logs. But rumors spread. Some say the Emperor knew of this place, that his psychic supremacy wasn't just dominance over the warp, but knowledge of where the warp ended. That he touched this place and turned back, not in fear, but in understanding. That the Golden Throne wasn't just a prison, it was a seal. Because if the warp has a shadow, this is its inversion. A dimension that doesn't kill chaos, it renders it irrelevant. And that kind of silence doesn't purify, it starves. There are places in the warp where time isn't broken. It's deliberate, not chaos, not randomness, but structure, recursive, rhythmic, designed. Events echo, not because memory clings, but because the moment itself is trying to become permanent. This isn't temporal drift, it's intentional loop. A demon slain in one jump reappears in another, identical scars, same grin, same last words. A navigator charts a safe course only to realize he's been following his own future path, etched in runes he hadn't yet drawn. A battle fought once appears again in dream, exact in every detail, right down to the scream of a dying crewman who hasn't been born yet. This is where prophecy comes from, not foresight, blueprint. Certain zones in the warp don't show what will happen, they assert what must. They generate inevitability, grinding probability down to a spine of absolute repetition. Not as punishment, as infrastructure. This is the engine, a conceptual machine embedded deep in the Materium, where belief isn't just reflected, it's enforced, where causality is a circuit, and your thoughts aren't predictions, they're power being routed through you. Imperial saints speak of moments when time stood still, where everything felt pre-lit. Some even recall the warp going quiet, utterly still, before erupting into a preordained miracle. These aren't legends, they're failures of resistance. The Materium didn't react, it loaded. Tzeentch worshippers seek these currents obsessively, not to control them, but to submit. They call it the dreaming core, the place where fate stops being fluid and becomes hardware, where a thought can reshape 10,000 years of history in reverse, where miracles don't happen because someone believes, they happen because the belief loop closed correctly. Aboard the Voice of Iron, an Adepta Sororitas vessel lost in Mandeville translation, every crew member was found kneeling in perfect formation, flash burned into their armor, bodies arranged around a cathedral-shaped void in the center of the ship. No shrine, just negative space. They hadn't been ambushed, they'd been configured. Their last vox burst. He dreamed us as a cathedral, and we obeyed. The warp isn't just an echo chamber, it's a system that tests interpretations. Each event is another draft. Each repetition is closer to the final version, and once the loop closes, the consequence becomes historical. Canon. Truth. You think the future comes later, but in the engine, the future is already designed, and the warp is just waiting for the rest of reality to catch up. Not everything that comes back is wrong. Some of it is too perfect. There are individuals who return from warp travel untouched, skin smooth, Vox records intact, memories sharp, and yet, they don't match. Medici scans show subtle changes, heart rhythms that sync to Geller field pulses, pupils that dilate in response to sacred scripture instead of light. One voidsman came back humming a hymn that hadn't been written yet, down to the pause between verses. These aren't mutations, they're revisions. The warp doesn't just warp, it rewrites, not with malice, with preference. It sends things back better, not kinder, not stronger, just more correct. To its logic, to the dream it's still drafting. Artifacts too, relics returned from lost ships that defy measurement, chalices that generate echoes when held, daggers that bleed when lied to. One picked recorder recovered from the wreck of the Heir of No One displayed footage from a battle no one remembered, but in which the faces of the dead clearly showed the current Inquisitorial High Council. The footage was archived, then deleted, then recovered by a system no tech priest confessed to authorizing. Some become vectors, carriers of unreal logic, warp-touched without visible corruption. Individuals who can't be mind-scanned because their thoughts are not formatted properly. Their dreams affect the waking world. Their prayers create static in Vox relays. One Imperial Guard sergeant was executed after her orders, issued in panic, manifested on sealed parchment before she spoke them. These are not demons, not psychers. They're formatted anomalies, survivors of unreality that's been installed. They're studied, feared, and sometimes weaponized. The Ordo Chronos refers to them as echo bearers. The Officio Assassinorum has tried, more than once, to replicate them, to manufacture the phenomenon. So far, none of the prototypes have survived longer than a few days, not because of warp feedback, because reality begins to reject them. Time gets slippery, doors won't open, systems log them in multiple locations simultaneously. One operative was found in his barracks, asleep, and in the center of the sun, at the same moment, logged by separate aurspecs. And there are the ships. Whole craft, returned from the warp with no crew. Hulls humming with voices that speak in questions only the ship seems to understand. Sometimes they dock perfectly. Sometimes they slam into orbital platforms as if trying to resync with a timeline they no longer belong to. These aren't ghosts. They're arguments, sent back by a realm that doesn't agree with how things are, and they're waiting to be proven right. There's something older than the warp, not before it, not outside it, beneath it. A stratum that resists language. A dimension that shows up in calculations only as remainder. Something left over after causality balances out. It appears in scraps, in contradictions, in data that shouldn't correlate but repeats across centuries, in cultures that never made contact. The Eldari had a word for it, Etehel Van, the pattern that does not return. The Necrontier called it Urbound, a term scrawled on tombs never meant to be opened. The Mechanicus refers to it carefully as the Black Hypothesis. And in the Ordo Malleus, its existence is acknowledged only in redacted silences, classified under levels so high no one even knows who wrote them. It isn't chaos. It doesn't manifest from emotion or belief or pain. It erodes those things. It has no symbols, no form. It precedes narrative. And where the warp feeds on souls, this place produces anti-meaning, not void, but untranslation. There are stories, denied, scrubbed, reinvented as myth, of entire sects dedicated to this nameless dimension. Cults that don't chant. They just stop making sense. Words break around them. Symbols fail. Even demons refuse to manifest near their rites, not from fear, but from lack of compatibility. The warp simply can't pass what they're doing. Some scholars, fringe, dangerous, brilliant, believe this is the source of the so-called fifth chaos power. Not a rival, not an equal, a failure state, a dimension that contains no gods because it predates the idea of divinity, a realm not shaped by souls, but by something colder, not apathy, not malice, contradiction. The tyrant star might be its vector, a cosmic wound that bleeds impossibility. Every appearance breaks record-keeping. Maps rearrange. Thought bends. The Adeptus Mechanicus has ceased classifying it, not due to irrelevance, but because every attempt to pin it down results in recursive data corruption. There is a reason no one speaks its true name. Not because it's forbidden, because it doesn't stay spoken. And then there is the Black Cube. Impossible to date. Unmovable. It casts no reflection, not in light, not in psychic vision, not in warp resonance. No rituals function near it, no oaths bind. One interrogator claimed to hear it think, not in words, in cancellation, like every truth he knew was being peeled away, line by line. It's not evil. That would require narrative. It's not alive. That would require origin. It's not meant to be. And yet it is, still here, still unspoken, still pushing against the frame of reality like a scream you'll never know you heard. You think it ends with light. A ship returns, a prayer is answered, a Geller field holds, the Emperor protects, but the transmission continues. Every moment in the warp is a message, not a scream, not always. Sometimes it's too low to hear, sometimes it sounds like your own thoughts, but it broadcasts, across space, across belief, across the shape of what can be known, not to deliver something, to see who's listening. The Imperium chants back, endlessly, litanies, vox loops, hymns etched into hulls, not just faith, volume, an empire that prays so loud it drowns out the truth, not because it understands, because it must never, ever stop. Silence would be worse, because something is waiting for silence. Inquisitors have traced vox feedback across lost sectors, same pattern, repeating at irregular intervals, not coded, not language, just presence. They call it the echo constant, not a warning, not a threat, just persistence. The black ships hear it sometimes, especially when carrying the strong ones, the psychers who don't scream in their sleep, who resist the warp, who touch something else entirely. They hear a voice, always different, always familiar, asking a question no one remembers after waking. No demon, no saint, no god, just the signal. And there's always another jump, another breach, another attempt to push deeper, to map the architecture of sin, of fear, of divinity. And each time something listens harder. You can silence a soul, you can banish a demon, you can erase a heretic's name from every archive in the noosphere, but you can't stop the message. It burns without origin, it arrives without motion, and every time a ship enters the warp, every time a thought reaches too far, every time a child dreams of a star they've never seen, the signal finds them, and it learns. You think it ends with light. A ship returns, a prayer is answered, a Geller field holds, the Emperor protects. But the transmission continues. Every moment in the warp is a message. Not a scream, not always. Sometimes it's too low to hear. Sometimes it sounds like your own thoughts. But it broadcasts, across space, across belief, across the shape of what can be known, not to deliver something, to see who's listening. The Imperium chants back endlessly, litanies, vox loops, hymns etched into hulls, not just faith, volume. An empire that prays so loud it drowns out the truth, not because it understands, because it must never ever stop. Silence would be worse, because something is waiting for silence. Inquisitors have traced vox feedback across lost sectors, same pattern, repeating at irregular intervals, not coded, not language, just presence. They call it the echo constant, not a warning, not a threat, just persistence. The black ships hear it sometimes, especially when carrying the strong ones, the psychers who don't scream in their sleep, who resist the warp, who touch something else entirely. They hear a voice, always different, always familiar, asking a question no one remembers after waking. No demon, no saint, no god, just the signal. And there's always another jump, another breach, another attempt to push deeper, to map the architecture of sin, of fear, of divinity. And each time, something listens harder. You can silence a soul, you can banish a demon, you can erase a heretic's name from every archive in the noosphere, but you can't stop the message. It burns without origin, it arrives without motion, and every time a ship enters the warp, every time a thought reaches too far, every time a child dreams of a star they've never seen, the signal finds them, and it learns.